Hi, everyone. Welcome to Transitions. I'm Anne Wagner, your host, and we're here recording at the Hunters Bay Radio Satellite Studio at Nipissing University in Bracebridge. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Suzanne Witt-Foley. Welcome, Suzanne.
Oh, thank you.
And Suzanne, you were here before, and we started talking about issues of anxiety. And we got so excited about talking about it, we really didn't get into all the topics.
We ran out of time.
Yeah. So you've been good enough to come back. And I'm just thinking this is very timely. We're at the time of year where students are nearing the end of their term. They're preparing for exams. They may be out looking for summer jobs. And it is a transitional period of year. And I'm wondering how that might play out in terms of increasing anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. Those transitional years are critical and key. We do start to see people, if they're going to develop, say, anxiety disorder, a lot of times those early signs and symptoms happen in adolescence. So it is a really important time to be aware of some of the stressors that we're experiencing, how that might be impacting us. And I know a little later in our interview we'll talk about this, but the importance of recognizing some of those signs and symptoms and getting help and support for that as soon as possible. I think last time as well we were talking about some of the different types of anxiety disorders.
Absolutely.
And when we're thinking in the framework of adolescence, I think it's really important to talk about social anxiety disorder, which is another kind or type of anxiety disorder. And remember last week or last time when we spoke, we acknowledged that, social threats can trigger stress response. And so I think that helps us to start to make sense of social anxiety disorder. And we do see more social anxiety disorder with young people. And if you think, well, I wonder why that would be. I'll take us back again to when we lived as hunter-gatherers for 150,000 years or so. What would happen when children turned to adolescence? It was a time where they would need to be leaving the nest, so to speak, right? And remember, we talked about one of the things we all need that's ingrained in our brain is social connectedness, because our brains think if we're not connected, if we're not part of a group, if I'm alone, I will die, right? Hunter-gatherer days, it was very risky to be all alone. We needed each other and the protection of one another, and that's why we have survived. So adolescence is a time where you might be leaving the nest and you no longer have your protective group of family, and so you need to form, your own or new protective groups of people. And so researchers are hypothesizing that that's often why in adolescence you'll often see teenagers shifting from being very family focused to sometimes having, significant focus and importance on their social relationships and their friendships. And so, needing that to survive. Now, for a young person, though, who might have a propensity for anxiety, or say a child who lives, with anxiety disorder, a lot of times during that period of adolescence, the disorder can turn to social anxiety, which, in some ways makes sense because the brains are wired to be very focused on, our social relationships for survival in adolescence.
Absolutely. And so that really speaks to the importance of, if you're a family member or a friend of a person experiencing this, that it really is significant. That
Yes.
It's not just something we can hope that they get over.
Right.
It's so fundamental to our physiology and the way we're wired
Yes.
that it's
Absolutely.
important we take it as a serious sign.
Yeah, and sometimes for those of us who don't experience that kind of anxiety, it might be hard to understand, right? But as you said, understanding that it's part of our physiology and the way that we're wired is important. People who live with social anxiety often have, some of the symptoms are a real fear of humiliation, embarrassment, or scrutiny by other people. They might fear that others are thinking negatively about them. And we know that shy children can sometimes develop social anxiety as they move into adolescence.
And are there other forms of anxiety disorders as well?
A few left on my list are obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's when people experience obsessions and compulsions that accompany all of those general feelings of anxiety. And just to explain, so obsessions are unwanted or inappropriate recurrent thoughts, impulses, or images that the person can't get rid of. And then compulsions are repetitive behaviors, such as counting, checking locks or the stove or hand washing. I remember, I don't know if you ever saw it, a really good movie that illustrated what it might be like for somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder. It was called As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson.
Oh.
Did you ever see it?
It sounds familiar, but I can't recall if I've actually seen it.
Yeah, so he lives with obsessive compulsive disorder. And sometimes, for those of us who don't have these experiences, it can really help us with our empathy and understanding and compassion by watching some movies that really, and that one people say is a good depiction of what it might be like.
Well, I'm just going to make a note of that, and we can get that up on the website too.
Oh, great. Good. And then there's also post-traumatic stress disorder. We've been hearing a fair bit about that, I think, in recent years in the news, in the media, which is a really good thing. Post-traumatic stress disorder can occur after somebody has experienced a significantly distressing event. We might hear about, veterans coming back from war, but it can really happen to anyone, but often after some kind of significant trauma or distressing event. And a lot of us will experience some kind of stress disorder after any kind of event, but it's if they continue to experience the symptoms for longer than a month. That's how we classify post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, what is happening essentially is this significant stressor is turning on our fight or flight system, turning on our stress response system to such a degree that it then becomes recalibrated, if you will, or dysregulated. And so the person may experience these reoccurring symptoms over, months, years even.
And do we know anything about what might put people at greater risk for developing an anxiety disorder?
Yeah, there's a variety of things that can be considered risk factors. There's no one single thing that causes. So I often think of you're born maybe with an empty glass, or perhaps if you have some genetics for some genetic risk factors, maybe your glass isn't perfectly empty when you're born, and then as you might experience a whole different variety of risk factors as you grow, mature, develop. At some point in time, maybe your glass becomes full. And when it becomes full, that can be the trigger for anxiety disorder. So gender, I know we talked about last time that
Yes.
women are, I think, almost twice as likely to experience anxiety disorder than men. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a risk factor. People who have a family history or have an anxious parent. So if you grew up with an anxious parent. So again, family history might be, there might be a genetic element, but also living in an environment with somebody who experiences anxiety, we often, learn and adapt behaviors that our parents might have or that our environment has. So that's a risk factor. We know that stressful life events can definitely be a trigger for younger children, particularly if they're living in environments of abuse or neglect or trauma. We know particularly younger children, it can have a significant impact on their later development of mental illness.
I think now's a good time to take a short break, hear from our sponsors, and we'll be right back with Suzanne Witt-Foley. Welcome back. I'm chatting with Suzanne Witt-Foley today, and you were just talking about some of the risk factors associated with the potential for developing an anxiety disorder.
Right. Another one of the risk factors is stressful life events. for people who might have experienced neglect or abuse or trauma. And I wanted to mention as well, particularly young children. We now know that younger children who are exposed to stressful life events or adverse childhood experiences have a significantly higher risk of developing mental illness later in life. And I was just going to speak for a minute about a study called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Have you heard of that?
I think I've heard of it, but I'm not very familiar with it.
Okay, so this was a large-scale study that was done in the United States a few years ago. And it was very simple premise. I think they had about 17,000 people participate in this study. And they asked them about 10 different indicators of early childhood adverse childhood experience. And so asked them things. Some of the indicators were, did your parents divorce? Did you have a parent who was incarcerated? Did you experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse or neglect? Did you have a parent with an addiction or a parent with a mental illness? So you kind of get the idea. And there were 10 different questions. And if you answered yes to any of them, you got a point. So the maximum would be like 10 out of 10 and the minimum, 0 out of 10. And what they found was that for people who had higher scores on those indicators, they had a significant increase in mental illness as well as chronic illness. So again, those stressful life events, and particularly early stressful life events, have a significant impact on the later development of mental illness, such as anxiety disorder.
So we're talking about in terms of risk. We're not saying that this is definitely conclusive that it will lead to an anxiety disorder.
No, and good to know, if you're thinking, I might have a few of those risk factors, good to be aware, because then you might also be more aware if you start to see some of the signs of anxiety and getting that help and support. But there's the weigh scale, if you will. And on one side of the weigh scale are a variety of risk factors that of course, as they pile up, can put us more at risk. But on the other side of the weigh scale are protective factors. And there are a significant number of protective factors that can help balance out that scale. So for some people, they may have significant risk factors, but they also have protective factors. Like, for example, one of the most significant protective factors for young people is to have one adult who you can talk to and that you trust and that you can go to. And that will have a significant protective effect over some of those risk factors. And there's a whole list of kinds of protective factors that can also be helpful.
Right.
Yeah. Just a few other of the risk factors for anxiety disorders is if people have other mental health problems as well, that we know, for example, that if a person experiences depression, they're much more likely at some point in their life to also experience anxiety. So sometimes depression and anxiety sort of go hand in hand. And then various drugs and even medications. But the drugs that I'm thinking of, stimulants. Stimulants mimic fight or flight. They mimic anxiety, if you think about it. A lot of what stimulants are intended to do is to rev up or speed up your system. Your heart rate, goes up, your blood pressure rises when we take stimulants. And so caffeine intake can impact the experience of anxiety, or it can at least be a risk factor or could exacerbate an experience of anxiety.
An important point, because one that can easily be moderated.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember just a short story. I was supporting a young man who was living with anxiety at the time. And I wasn't really thinking. I said to him, we were chatting on the phone, and I said, let's get together for a coffee. That's something we often will say.
Yes.
And the idea, of course, being good intentions to get together and talk and chat. So we did get together for a coffee, and I said, I'll buy you a coffee. And I ordered mine. I said, what would you like? And I think he said, I'll order an extra large coffee with a triple shot of espresso, added to it. And it dawned on me, and I thought, Yeah, caffeine is probably not a good thing when you're experiencing anxiety, or
Right.
can even be a precursor too. And I think about a lot of the highly caffeinated beverages, that are out there today.
Absolutely. It's a
That
big market.
well, that's it. When I'm talking with young people, particularly, because a lot of those drinks are sometimes marketed to young people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when I was a teenager, pretty much, other than, you might have a Coke once in a while, but otherwise, really the caffeinated beverage was black coffee, which none of us really drank until we were, in our 20s. But today, a lot of our young people are exposed to coffee, and now with the the mochaccino, frappuccino,
Yes.
all these deluxe and sweetened caffeinated beverages, we're seeing, I think, for some people, significantly more intake or greater intake of caffeine, which, as I say, can be a risk factor as well. So just something to be aware of.
Absolutely. So, do you have any ideas about what you can do if you're either experiencing anxiety or at risk of experiencing serious anxiety?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think in terms of what helps is getting support early. We know in terms of, how our brains work and how they're developed, if, brain pathways are developed by repeated sort of exposures. So if you're feeling, symptoms of anxiety in certain situations and you let it go for, say, 10, 15 years, you develop patterns in your brain that are really difficult to change. So the earlier that people can receive support for symptoms, the sooner we can kind of change those brain pathways and teach people, new skills and new ways to cope and adapt. To alleviate the anxiety. So that one's really important, is getting that help early, even if it doesn't seem like much of a symptom or it's really not too much of a bother yet. Always worth getting it, checked out so you can kind of change that path. And in the heat of it, I like this one too. Sometimes just something as simple as slow, deep breathing. And I know that sounds, you think, how can that work? But again, as we talked about earlier, the relationship with anxiety, with fear, with the fight or flight system. When your fight or flight is turned on, we talked about how you're trying to get oxygen to your muscles. Your body is trying to give your muscles a supply. So you start breathing rapidly.
Yes.
So you can fool your brain just by taking some slow, deep breaths that, are intentional. Basically, that will tell your brain, well, I can't be in fight or flight because I don't breathe like that in fight or flight.
Okay.
And it will start to calm the system. So even something simple like that. We talked about the power of connection.
Absolutely.
We talked about how important when we feel connected, included, and that we belong, that takes us out of stress response. So one of the things that helps is staying connected, trying to be connected with friends, with family. Connecting with counseling and other kinds of support is really important as well. We know that some of the strategies that we're using today have been evaluated and are showing some really excellent success. So one of the strategies is cognitive behavioral therapy that a lot of therapists are using. And what that is helping people to recognize unhelpful thoughts and behaviors, to monitor, evaluate, and even change thinking patterns that are contributing to anxiety. Another sort of newer therapeutic approach that again is showing some great success is called dialectical behavior therapy, which really is cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as it incorporates mindfulness. It helps people to live in the present moment and pay attention to their thoughts, emotions, and experiences right here and now. There's kind of a joke that if you live with anxiety, a lot of times you're living in the future. Remember, we talked about how anxiety is future-focused fear.
Yes.
And sometimes for people with depression, they may be living or dwelling on the past. And so mindfulness can be really helpful for people who experience depression or anxiety to help bring us to the present moment and pay attention in the present moment.
And so where might people go if they want to get some support around these issues?
There's a variety of places that people can go. Here locally is, or anywhere, is our Canadian Mental Health Association. So we have a Muskoka Parry Sound branch of the Canadian Mental Health Association here in Muskoka, and that's predominantly an adult service, and they provide services for no cost. So that would be one place that people can reach out and get help. Our Children's Mental Health Service is Family, Youth, and Child Services of Muskoka. And they have a walk-in clinic that anybody can walk in without an appointment and receive service. The Kids Help Phone might be another place that people can receive support and service, whether it's by phone or could be online or through texting.
So these are great resources, and maybe if you can come up with any more, we could post them all on our YouTube site. So I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming in, Suzanne.
You're
it's always
welcome.
A pleasure to talk to you.
You're welcome.
And thanks for listening. This has been Transitions at Hunters Bay Radio, and we'll speak to you next week again.